Join up. So there's joy. Be patient. All right. We'll get going. If folks join late, they join late. That's fine. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. My name is Margot Farrell. I'm the Chief of Staff here at the Root Center. We appreciate you guys joining us for these forums, and we're really excited for this topic. The epidemic of loneliness, the silent sadness. It's a topic that you've probably heard about, especially now with election season going on. A lot of politicians, Chris Murphy, Senator Anwar, who have made this really a vocal point for us to talk about. And we thought that this would be really great to get everyone together, an eclectic group of panelists to speak more about this topic and just have a thought-provoking evening like these have been traditionally in the past. Before we get started, I just want to let you know some housekeeping items. We are recording this, so if you could put your phone on silent, that'd be great. The bathroom is down this hallway on your left-hand side, and the emergency exit is right there. When you come out on the right-hand side, there's a stairwell that'll take you downstairs. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Steven Zuckerman, our CEO and president. You told me you wanted to. Oh, the front of the mic. Yep.
Well, welcome. We're excited to have you all here. This is our fifth community forum, I think, and this was a topic that Margaret and I went back and forth on. But I thought, what better topic really to think about right now is loneliness. So I think there's a lot of that going on right now with recent events politically. But I know myself over the past couple of years with some own personal events, loneliness has certainly hit. So I think there's probably not a person in this room who hasn't suffered from this at one point or another. So we're excited to be here tonight, excited that you all take your time, volunteer, wanted to participate as well. And we hope it's a thought-provoking evening. Thank you.
All right, so we'll begin by having each of the panelists introduce themselves and what their connection to the cause is. Allison, if you'd like to kick off.
So I'm Dr. Allison Gaffey. I am trained as a clinical psychologist, but I am faculty. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Internal Medicine at Yale School of Medicine, specifically in the section of cardiovascular medicine. And I'm primarily a researcher. So I research what the biomedical establishment would say are non-traditional risk factors for high blood pressure, hypertension, and heart disease. So those include stress, sleep, social determinants of health, as well as social support. I'm also interested in sex differences and how those factors may relate to risk for heart disease. So associations which are specific to men and to women. And I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Andi.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Andi Campbell. I am the president of Wellspark Health. We're a company owned by Connecticut locally, and our enterprise is EmblemHealth out of New York City. Primarily what we do is early intervention through a health coaching model for employers around the country, helping to improve the population of their workforce. Focused specifically around, of course, chronic condition management, but a lot of that has to do with the distress of being diagnosed with a condition, even early stage. So that's my connection to the topic.
Deb.
Hello, everyone. I am Deb Bibbins. I am the founder and CEO of a Connecticut nonprofit called For All Ages, which is dedicated to connecting the generations and inspiring action to end loneliness, reduce ageism, and improve health. And 1 year ago, following our U.S. Surgeon General's declaration of loneliness as a public health crisis, we began convening what's called the Connecticut Collaborative to End Loneliness, which is a statewide cross-sector public-private initiative to foster social connectivity for residents of all ages across the state of Connecticut.
Hi, I'm Saud Anwar. I'm currently serving as a state senator for the 3rd Senate District, the towns of East Hartford, South Windsor, Ellington, and East Windsor. But I do spend a lot of time in Manchester as I've worked out of Manchester Hospital as well. I'm a pulmonologist and an intensivist by profession. I have a master's in public health from Yale. Looking at, I'm currently serving as the co-chair of Public Health Committee for the past few years for the state of Connecticut. Mental health, mental well-being, opioids, these are front and center of what policies we are looking at. And being at Root Center has helped me learn a lot. So I'm going to be learning, but also sharing what I've learned a little bit from other sources as well. And have had the opportunity to learn from Deb firsthand a few times and good to learn about this aspect, but this remains a very important issue. Senator Murphy brought this to light as well and raised awareness at the level that needed to be heard by people across the board. And also at the national level, it's getting the attention. But it's a far bigger issue, and it's a symptom of something that's happening that we need to have a better handle on. So hopefully we'll learn together later today.
Dr. Nazarian.
Hello, my name is John Nazarian. I'm a psychiatrist specializing in addictions. Currently, I am medical director at Community Mental Health Affiliates in New Britain. It's a large nonprofit organization that treats a wide variety of individuals with psychiatric illness. I also have had a private practice that was geared more towards helping folks with addictions. But after 2020, with the pandemic, the vast majority of the folks coming in to see me were less and less dealing with addiction and more with depression and anxiety. And loneliness was definitely a part of that picture. And just my connection here too is that as of December 3rd, I will be the Chief Medical Officer here at Root.
Peter.
Hi, I am Peter Donato. I am currently the Vice President of Clinical Services at Apple Rehab. I have been there for about almost 2 years now. I started at Apple Rehab as the VP of Substance Use Disorder, which is how I established the collaboration and partnership with the Root Center to handle the substance use disorder and mood and methadone programs. Now I'm responsible for all the clinical services, which is all of nursing and everything else clinical. So that's pretty fun. So that's my day-to-day. We have 20 long-term care facilities all throughout the state of Connecticut. So I'm pretty busy, and I am here to provide the perspective of the long-term care or nursing home resident as it relates to the epidemic of loneliness.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. You guys all can hear already that the backgrounds from everyone is so eclectic, but we all have a common ground. And I was doing some research, getting ready for tonight, and there was one statistic in particular that I think I'm going to use to kick us off here. The mortality impact of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity and physical inactivity. And that was reported by the Surgeon General, the US Surgeon General, and it was pretty staggering to hear that when you hear of something that seems a little bit vague, maybe a little bit loneliness. How do you quantify that? You can quantify smoking a cigarette, but how do you quantify that? When you hear that statistic, what does that say to you about where we stand right now as a country with this issue facing us? Deb, maybe you'll start us off.
Sure. Well, I guess my response is that loneliness has been a problem for decades, but we haven't talked about it. And one of the things that I'm glad we're doing today is talking about it. Loneliness is the root cause of so many things, from anxiety to depression to substance abuse, suicidal ideation. And for older adults, we've got the physical results of loneliness, chronic loneliness, which is to start with a 50% higher probability of developing some form of dementia, a 56% higher probability of having a stroke, and nearly a 30% higher probability of developing heart disease. And so I think when they put all of that together, right, and we're looking at it, and our federal government is analyzing what are the root causes of these deaths, that it comes back to loneliness. And so as social beings, or as humans, I guess, we're social beings. Each one of us needs social connection. We don't often think about it and we don't often talk about it, but we need it. And it's the foundation of our mental and our physical health.
And you see that, and we're mentioning a lot of cardiac issues, and that was the other prevalence that I was seeing was you're mentioning stroke, hypertension. A lot of the research that you do, Allison, perhaps speak a little bit about how it does manifest in very physical and real symptoms.
Yes, I'm happy to. And I also want to emphasize that loneliness is a problem regardless of how old you are. We see growing data, especially with increasing use of social media, where loneliness is becoming an epidemic, or perhaps is already in younger adults and middle-aged adults as well. But when we think about the way in which loneliness affects us physically, it has been associated with things like inflammation, disruption in the hormone cortisol, which is an indicator of stress in your body, and even things like affecting your blood pressure. And we see this in laboratory contexts where people will fill out a survey about how lonely they felt or how much social support they feel like they have. And we see these associations in large scale data sets as well. So the data holds up in a lot of different contexts. And I think that it's interesting because we may be looking amongst younger adults now and capturing what loneliness may look like, but they may not see the repercussions for years in terms of hypertension, in terms of some of those cardiac outcomes that you mentioned.
Senator Dunbar, you've done a lot to try to move this forward from more of a, a legal standpoint from the state level. Speak a little bit about how you guys are moving in that direction. We know obviously this is a huge point for Chris Murphy. You spoke about this topic, even you mentioned towards it at our International Overdose Awareness Day over the summer.
So in the last session, what we were looking at was what do we do as a solution to this? And we were looking at what are the various ways to approach this. Here's how I'm seeing this, and this is based on multiple conversations and being part of even at the UN General Assembly, this was a dark conversation. So I was asked to be part of that conversation at more of a listener, like I am here. This is a global issue. But there are multiple paths to it, like the children have a different path to it, the adults have a different path, and the seniors have a different path. And then the solutions may be somewhat similar if we move forward with that idea. The human interaction and the connectedness is the center of it all. And our hope was when we have this committee fully functional, the number of people and because of the dynamics of all that's involved, we actually asked so many people to be hands-on for the solution in our legislation. The ultimate part is how do you connect people? How do you have that connectedness? And part of that connectedness could be decentralized. And the thought was that in many years ago, when we were trying to have human relation commissions in different parts of every town was supposed to have a human relation commission, so we interact well. There should be loneliness management or loneliness related committee or commission in every town. And so that we start to have interactions of all different age groups and decentralize it so that the interactions start to happen, the human interactions start to happen for people who are seeking that. And that has been the goal. We're trying to see how we can legislate it without putting too much money into that option. And so that's going to be something that we'll explore in the 2025 session. So have it seeds in every town for this to happen.
And Peter, when we hear this, you mentioned when you introduced yourself that you're talking from more of the perspective of connecting people with long-term support. What do you see on a day-to-day basis with the patients at your facilities? And then, when they do go home and they don't have those connections that they have around them when they are in the facility?
I just want to say, first of all, I'm so glad that the people on the panel that are smarter than me were able to quantify the data about the loneliness and the side effects from that, right? Because we saw that from the skilled nursing perspective with the pandemic, right? And I don't think if you weren't in the long-term care industry at that time, when COVID first started and CMS, which is Medicare, Medicaid, and DPH told us basically, you can't come into the nursing home anymore to see your loved one, basically shut the doors, lock the doors, that's it. And we had to close the doors. And they even told us to close the doors to the resident rooms. So not only close and lock the front door, but close all the doors to your resident rooms and basically don't let them come out. So we did that. And that was heartbreaking, right? So okay, bye, Mrs. Smith, we're closing your door and we're only opening it when we have to go in. We were told to limit our interactions, to go in when they needed help and when they had to go to the bathroom and to bring their meals. But I don't think that we would ever do that again. I think that's been realized that probably wasn't the best decision at the time, right? So when we talk about things like that led to those adverse events, like deaths, which we can't account for the deaths that happened from loneliness resulting from that, but we probably know that happened, right? So I just wanted to mention that, but it's different when people leave our facilities and go home and they're not connected. I feel like sometimes it's the opposite for us. They're more connected when they're in the community versus when they come to us. We see it differently. Somebody coming from the community that may be living independently or modified independently in the community is going to have a much harder time coming into a facility and basically getting their independence taken away, right? You're coming from a place that you are, living in your own home where you have your freedoms and you can do what you want, to coming into an institutionalized setting. And I'm not talking about long-term care bad. This is my livelihood and I've devoted my life to it and I love it. But you're coming into a setting where we're telling you what time you're going to get up and when you're going to eat and what you're going to eat and what time you're going to go to bed. And, you know, we try to individualize our care, but there's certain things that we have to do. So think of how much gets taken away from you when you come into a facility and how much that affects you.
Well, I think that's interesting, you know, when you talk about the opposite of what people may be thinking is, yeah, maybe they are exposed to more people on a day-to-day basis when they're in your facility. Dr. Nazarian, I'd love to, you know, have some of your input from your private practice, especially at meeting with patients. And have you noticed a change in the course of your career from maybe how patients were presenting 10 years ago, 20 years ago to how they are now? Have you seen certain things in our society that have shifted the way people are presenting now?
I've seen a few things. Although in the beginning, the vast majority of the folks come to my private practice were suffering from opioid use disorder. So they had already experienced a lot of isolation because of their addiction and had been cut off from many of their family members, many of their friends. And the only people they associated with were people that had something to do with their ongoing use. So they were already cut off from the more sustaining connections that they had had. What I saw over time was that got worse, that even more isolation. And then as the nature of the folks coming in, less and less for addiction and more for depression, anxiety, ADHD, even those individuals who didn't have a particular reason to be isolated still talked about it. Because I always would ask, well, who are your friends? Who are you spending time with? Who are your supports? And more, they had fewer answers for me. Maybe a parent, rarely a close friend, sometimes a significant other. But even then, their interaction wasn't necessarily one of those where they're always spending time together. They lived separately. Their time together was very limited. I saw that. I didn't have a good explanation for why, but I certainly saw that happen.
And they do say in the statistics that the age group that they're seeing the biggest decline in some of those social connections is in that 15 to 24 age group. And that in the last survey, it was most Americans were saying they didn't even have as many as 3 close friends in their circle. So kind of what you're speaking. And I know, Deb, with your nonprofit, you focus a lot on the 2 generations that tend to be impacted the most, which are the very young and the older.
Yeah.
Speak a little bit about why you think maybe that's falling into place. And in a time where this generation, the younger generation, they don't know a world without social media, where it seems like you'd be most connected, but it's actually leading to more time separated from each other.
Yeah, well, exactly, Margot. When we look at the young adult population, exactly, they have really grown up with social media. They have grown up with phones in their hands, and they're very comfortable looking at what others are doing and being very passive, right? A lot of people that I talk to call it doom scrolling. So they're just scrolling and they're looking at what they believe is something positive happening with friends, but it really is all about just the highlights of someone's life that they share on social media. It's not all of their entire life. And as teens, they may not realize that, right? They're looking for that belongingness, that sense of belonging. They're looking for the group that they want to and can be connected with and feel that sense of connection and belongingness. And the social media impact has been extremely detrimental. And, you know, I think I'm really a fan of what's happening now in middle schools and high schools throughout the state of Connecticut, where those packets are being implemented so that the youth are putting their phones in the packets. I've talked to a number of youth who have said, we welcome it. We believe now this is going to enable us to get back to talking to our friends again. And so when you hear it at that very profound level and very personal level, you realize just how detrimental some social media and the path that we've been on for a while has been to our youth.
a lot of times people think that the social media is what's keeping us together or makes you feel as though you have those stronger connections with people when, in fact, when you think, well, when's the last time you maybe saw that person physically? Or had a conversation over the phone, even that seems antiquated at this point. Senator Otto, I looked like you were about to jump in with something.
Yeah, so initially I was saying to Deb, I'm gonna say something controversial in the middle of this thing. And as I'm so close to you, you're gonna have to elbow me in a little. But here's what I've been learning. And then there are about a few studies that are already out there and it started from England. They have the NHS system, which is one of the largest database that we have for the entire country. And they're looking at the lack of connectedness and this is what was going on with the youth. And if you look at that mindset that they have a data of what they're trying to look at with the youth, they also were working with a mindset, meeting people where they are. So they work with apps, the disease that is causing them to be not connected, which were focused on the mental well-being. And they started to have interactions so that the peers would interact with each other in the local community. So the UK is doing that study, and then the numbers are somewhat positive. California has implemented this now, and Pennsylvania is doing it very differently, where they're actually looking at one school system. And an entire school system is on that app, where they're now interacting to be able to become peers of each other. So when I first had a reaction, when I looked at it, I said, well, why are we using this for the thing that caused the problem to be used for the solution? But then as it's starting to look at some of the data coming back in, there's something to it, to meeting people where they are on this aspect for the youth. So we may end up learning a lot more about this because so much is happening and it's easy to generate that data because every click is a data point. And then you can start to see. So I'll put this out there. I'm sure there'll be some reactions and conversations on this and the only data is on the young people who are using this.
Does anyone want to go off or Senator? Yes.
I'm glad to jump in. So thank you for sharing that. I was unaware of those studies and I want to look into them further. So I think that, what each of you said is really important. Deb, I know that we all know that there's so much data showing the negative implications of social media use on loneliness, on that feeling of isolation. And I think in large part, or a large part of that relates to the social comparisons, which are extended and expanded upon to no end by that type of technology. By being on all the social media apps, people are looking at, oh, wow, this person's having so much fun, they have so many likes, they have so many friends, whereas, as you said, it's a very thin slice of a person's real life and often is distorted. But what you said, I think, Senator, makes a lot of sense in that there are opportunities to use that technology and to harness that in a beneficial way, and to kind of use the double-edged sword and potentially use the positive edge of that sword in those types of interventions. And I think that could be very powerful.
Andi.
Yeah, I'll offer a perspective from the employer's world, because that's where I come from. And I think about the implication of again, not for necessarily the youth, but maybe even the early career, folks coming into early career. And then, of course, all of us are in a workplace. And I think there is two things really happening relative specifically to technology, in that, hybrid workforce or hybrid working since COVID, obviously, and remote working, and then coupling that with the idea that people aren't expected to connect in the same way that they used to be, but employers are struggling with how to figure out what their responsibility is in that. And I don't want to underestimate or undervalue that power of the employer, because so many people have a job, and where their job is where they often learn about their health, receive their health benefits, have opportunity to get some education around their health, and to connect with others. And so, I think there's a ripe opportunity for solutioning, bringing employers into the conversation in a way that we never have in this country.
Anybody want to go off at that point?
Just a quick comment. It kind of gets amplified in my arena too when you talk about healthcare, because a lot of the professionals or non-professionals, so either nursing or CNAs that are coming out of programs, came out during COVID time, right? So they were churned out when they had to be very, very quickly. So they don't even know how to talk to patients or residents, as we call them in long-term care. So that's really doubling the problem, you know, of the loneliness. It's not helping, so.
And there's not necessarily an answer to this, but it just, to me, begs the question, two of the main things that we're hearing that seem to have worsened this, COVID and social media, or the use of phones, the internet. What do you say to that?
So I was listening to somebody who said that there are 4 Cs, right? COVID, and then there is the challenge that people have had with conflicts, whether it's family conflicts or the world conflicts. Third is for the young people, the climate, because that's an existential threat that people are worried about. And then the cell phone and all the things that come with it. The 4 Cs sort of have added so much stress that it's adding the entire trajectory of their life being impacted. And you can break it down further in that component, but that's very real. And for the seniors, what you're seeing also is there's a health declining and then loss of a loved one and their inability to get transportation. And I interact with patients every day in the outpatient setting, and we have conversation outside of their lungs. And I see patterns. There are families that live together. Sometimes there's the 3 generations that are living very close to each other. They do a little better, the seniors, because they're interacting with the young children, the grandchildren, and the parents are dependent as well. And now the ones who are struggling are people who have their loved ones in all different parts of the country. And their interactions are very limited. And so that loneliness or that connection is there, but then they have their friends if their health is with them. So we were meant to be somewhat local, and we have become too spread out.
And it's almost like having access to the phones, to the social
Yeah.
media, it makes you feel like, well, it's okay. I see them online, or I sent them a text yesterday. I saw pictures of them from over the weekend. And so you feel this false sense of connection.
Yeah,
There's a lady who came and I sometimes hold their hand. And I held her hand and I said, "How are you doing?" She said, when was the last time somebody touched my hands like this? No, it's been many months. So the human touch, the physical touch of holding a hand is not even happening as much, people. There's something about it.
And just being in the same physical space,
Yeah.
right? And sharing an interaction and being able to see whether someone's smiling, right? And just being part of that shared moment with someone else is so beneficial to each one of us. And I think exactly what you're saying, when we have multi-generational households, it's beneficial to everyone involved. And the trend that really began, with a lot of college students moving away to a college in another state and then graduating and starting their lives in that state, we've gotten to this disconnectedness within families that has just evolved over time. And I'm not saying that everyone has to go to college locally and stay next to their parents, but it's just something that we have to be aware of and be thoughtful around how do we overcome that? And how do we foster those connections in a way that can help to offset what the reality is of where we're living today. A lot of the people that come to For All Ages looking to help are people that culturally have grown up in multi-generational households. And it's just been a very interesting dynamic to see that people say, yeah, I get it. I understand what you're trying to do, and I want to be a part of the solution. So, we know there's power there. We're social beings. We're learning from one another, and it's just very powerful and impactful.
From a standpoint of, wanting to give folks a tangible thing to take away, Dr. Nazarian, let's say, you have a patient who's come in, they're talking to you about these feelings of loneliness, these feelings of depression, despair, not knowing who to turn to. What is something tangible that you would give a patient, that you would give someone that they can take away to maybe start moving in the right direction to fix those feelings, to try and fix that environment for themselves?
Some of the people that I work with talk about how they used to have connection, excuse me, either with a relative that they had a a closeness to or a friend, and they would lament that this relationship has just become distant or has frayed. And they say, I'd kind of like to reach out. And I think sometimes people need that extra encouragement. Go ahead, because if you don't, you have a guarantee they'll do it for you. Go ahead and make that connection. Go ahead and reach out. And I think sometimes when people get that permission, say, or encouragement to do so, they'll actually make that try. And it doesn't always work. Doesn't always work that someone will reach out and something positive will come back. But I think enough times, if someone tries, that they may find something positive coming back. Or just encouraging them to be in places where other people are going to be. For example, this is a little bit different from my private practice, where I am currently. We work mostly with the chronically mentally ill, people with severe illness, people who generally are very isolated anyway, because of their symptoms or because of their living situation or the poverty that they live in. And we also have a program that is oriented towards young adults. And we have an organization, a part of our organization called the Social Club, where we have counselors and we have occupational therapists where people are encouraged to come in. Sometimes we'll have activities for them during the day. There are games. There are also activities to develop independent living skills. But we're finding that it isn't enough just to have this place open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. So we are in the process of opening up times on the weekends, in the evenings, because usually these folks go home and they don't have anyone else to interact with. So trying to provide more. And when we're getting folks to come into these hours at the Social Club, they do end up making connections with each other, whereas otherwise they never would have met each other. And the more we encourage folks to come, there's a lot of resistance at first, but when they do show up, they find that they can make a connection with somebody else.
Do you think that people are, because of the ease of everything now, people are more challenged in making connections in general? Like it was, you look at maybe the generation that did not grow up with phones. Are they having more of a difficulty now doing something that maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't a challenge to them, but it's like we've forgotten how? Do you think that, obviously we talk about the younger generation, they don't know any different. They've grown up in a world with a cell phone in their hand and social media, before they could walk sometimes. So what do you think it's showing in terms of folks who have lived a life prior to that world, but now are fully immersed in it? Has it kind of taken away from our ability to do what we once knew how to do?
I have a passionate opinion on this. It's my own opinion, I'll say, but let me preface it with it being my own passionate opinion. But so I think that there's a skill that I call holding space. And I believe that it's something that as humans, we have forgotten how to do. And for especially our youth, we haven't really taught them how to do it. And it's holding space for someone's unique experience as a human. So, I lose my father and I say to somebody, I lost my father, and they say, oh, when that happened to me, fill in the blank. Or when I say I have a cancer diagnosis, they say my mother had cancer and she made it through. Or I got divorced and somebody receives that and says, when I got divorced, it was tough, but you'll be fine. You're young. You're going to meet someone else. And I think we have an obligation as a society to do a better job at stepping back and saying, that sounds really hard, and teaching people the power of that pause. And we talk about, we hear the power of the pause. I like to call it just letting things breathe and holding space for it. And I do think there was a time when people did that more because they were interacting in a different way. And when we are online and we have instant gratification and instant response, there isn't space for holding space, and there isn't space for the breathing that happens. And I, from an employer perspective, I'll just say, obviously you can hear I'm passionate about this. This is the #1 skill I think that we need to teach managers in jobs. And the reason I say that is because I think a lot of times people go to their manager and they say, hey, I had a such and such happen at home. The first person they tell is their manager because they're going to be late for their shift. They're not gonna make it to work, or something's going on. And what a unique opportunity we all have to intervene as adults for young or older people. It doesn't matter if they're going to a job, especially the fact that we could pause, take a step back and say, that sounds really hard. what would be best for me to support you today? And just right there, building that connection, I really think it could change the trajectory of what we're doing. And I think going back to what you're talking about generationally, I don't know that we always ever really did this well, to be honest. I think though that we had more space to learn how to do it when we weren't so focused on instant response.
I'm gonna, another twist to it. I agree with everything that you've said, and your passions are actually rightfully placed from my.
Thank you for the acknowledgement. Not controversial.
I served as a mayor, and I'll give you two examples. In the past, the children used to go and walk to school way back. Now the children are not able to walk to school. They're not allowed to walk to school because God forbid something can go wrong. And then something may have gone wrong, but that information is spread in such a manner that everybody believes it's going to happen every single day, every single moment with their loved one. And 2 generations ago, everybody was walking to school for the most part. And now we tried to do one day to walk to school. We had to have the police cover the entire area, make sure everybody's safe. But that's what it came down to, was because we can't have children walk to school, even if it's 1 mile. If you look at from a risk stratification perspective, the risks are far lower than they had ever been. But despite that, we use at one example that because social media also is information, and bad information is shared quite a bit. So we have perspectives that have been created. So that's one example I want to give. The second thing, I used to give a talk where I would start with the young boys and girls, students, to say that your mayor decides how long you live. So what do you mean? So, well, there are policies that you can make, which is going to make the entire society be healthier. If you get more sidewalks, you actually get green spaces, and so on. In the same way, your policymakers have an impact through policies to reduce this isolation by creating mechanisms, programs, and projects where you don't have a choice but to have human interaction increase. Some of those interactions may not be good, but most of them will be good. So from a public health perspective, you're willing to take a little bit of that risk for a broader good. And then that's why I look at it from a policy perspective. We have to figure out what do we need to do to reduce these risks. And then that's part of what I said initially, that we create a local gathering spaces for people.
I want to make a point about, so thank you for sharing both of your perspectives. I want to make a point about like risk stratification and also just kind of the definitions we use. So in the literature, the scientific literature, a lot of these associations we're talking about in terms of mortality, morbidity, cancer, heart disease, what have you, those data and those outcomes that we're seeing are based on self-report. They're based on one's perceived loneliness. So you could be an individual with a large family, with a large network of friends, but if you feel lonely, then that is going to confer your risk rather than necessarily feeling isolated, which is viewed as kind of a more objective term. So I think it's really, especially when I think about the patients I work with, I work at the VA in West Haven in cardiology, and I ask them about their social support, as all of us do as clinicians, and some of them are very comfortable saying, I have 3 people, those are my people, it's my spouse, my sibling, and my adult child. And that's it for me. And that is what serves them. They don't feel lonely. They feel like they're supported. And perhaps they'll fare better than someone who has a larger network, but still feels lonely. So I think it's important to think about, the nuance within some of these terms and how people may take them on and apply them to themselves. So again, loneliness in the literature, at least, and oftentimes is very subjective.
Thank you for pointing that out, because it is often, the 2 words are used interchangeably and they are very different concepts. As you say, isolation is objective and loneliness is something that we have to admit to. We have to be willing to admit to it. And there is a stigma around loneliness. And the way that I like to think about it is the same way and talk about it is the same way we talk about hunger. When we're hungry, it means we need food. So we get up, we go to the refrigerator and we open the door and we grab an apple and we're eating. Well, when we're lonely, we need social connection. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with us. It simply means we need to be intentional around finding positive social connection in our life where we are going to get a sense of belonging. And we may not know what that is. You may have to try a few different things. You may have to go to a yoga class and see if you connect with a couple of people there. You may have to go to, the library and attend an event at the library and see if you've got something in common with a couple of other people that are there. So it's a very personal solution, right? And it's very localized, as you say. And it's something that's so different for each of us that it's nearly impossible, I'm going to say, to prescribe on an overall level to solve it. Like, we have to be intentional actors in helping to solve it for ourselves, our family, our friends, our community. And I think when we all come together and start thinking about it and saying, okay, there's something I can do. I can call my mom today. I can reach out to my college roommate. And there's these little steps we can each take. If we all start taking them, then together we'll lift each other up.
And also realizing it's more of a quality over quantity type thing, but with social media and the access to information online, making you believe like, well, this is actually the answer. Try yoga class, or go to this group at the library, or try this new diet. And you don't know where to start sometimes because it's almost like there's an influx of all this information or all these different options. And what might satiate one person is not at all the same for someone else.
And it's really hard as an adult to put yourself out there, right? For a lot of people, they're introverted and they don't want to try the new thing. They'd rather just stay home.
That's exactly what I was going to say, that it is extremely difficult. And I think that inertia can take over as well. Because I was reading also that the amount of time that people are spending at home by themselves, or even just alone, even if they do live with family or friends, has increased incredibly since 2020. And getting beyond that inertia, despite the fact that there might be a fear involved, to actually walk out the door and go to one of these places, it is very difficult. I mean, it's difficult for those who do have friends to get over the inertia, to go and make a plan to see a friend. Even if you know they want to see you, it can still be difficult to overcome that barrier.
I think we have to help each other do that. My mom's a great example. She is very shy and she is very hesitant to go into a new space where she knows no one. But if I go with her, 10 minutes in, she's chatting it up with 2 other people. And then the next time, the next week, she says, oh no, I don't need you. I'm good. I'm comfortable. So sometimes I think, if we can help each other out, if we're so fortunate to be able to call on someone to get that assistance, just even to enter a new space and feel safe, I think that's important. Maybe that's a way to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then I think about your patients in long-term care, and I think that there's another side to this, which is, how do you manage those feelings when maybe you're limited in your ability to go places and to meet new people and do things? How can you manage that in real time in a way that is going to sustain you?
Given all the challenges that we have with staffing and everything surrounding that. So it becomes really difficult. And we try to engage family if they have family, right? And technology to the extent that we have with virtual visits and pet therapy and recreation therapy and indoor gardening and all those things to engage them. And we've taken really a back to basics approach with our staff, just trying to get them to do simple things like talk to our patients again when they're giving care, which is something that comes natural to us, right? That we learned in school, but they maybe didn't recently, so when you're giving a bed bath or when you're giving medications, to talk to your patients and simple things like that help, and engage them. And what did you do? Where did you work when you were younger? Or tell me about your family, or what you like to do, or what kind of music, and then play that music next time when you're in the room with them, giving them a bath. And those types of things, can make a big impact in somebody's life. So it's little things like that in our setting that do make a big difference, but it's getting the word out there. And, That's the hard part.
The next part I was gonna say was, we've mentioned loneliness and we've mentioned social isolation, and both have a very different approach. But when you look at the statistics, what I thought was interesting was that for loneliness, 26% respectively, and for social isolation, 29%, that was the risk for premature death. So whether we're looking at it from an isolation perspective or from a loneliness perspective, and one may be viewed a little bit more favorably than the other, they're still both resulting in a higher chance of mortality. So anyone take a stab at that? From what you've seen in your research.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not surprised. I think that, like I said before, loneliness is subjective, and I think social isolation is more objective. But regardless of the overlap and the differences, they're both about social connection, right? And we know based on the research that the absence or the less social connection for most people, for the average human, is associated with adverse effects on your health. And so it's unsurprising, but I do think that it's important when we are sharing this information with the public, that they understand the difference so that they can interpret for themselves, like, am I lonely? Or am I just, living in a rural part of the state, or of the country, and doing what I can to manage within this context?
Because if that's what you were familiar with, and maybe that's where you grew up, like you're saying, in a rural area, maybe it doesn't seem problematic to you, or you don't think it's a problem. But what we're seeing just from the research standpoint is that even if you're okay with it, just not having that external connection is still going to be an indicator that things may be more difficult health-wise progressively. I mean,
Yeah, and I think, I don't know exactly that statistic, but I think it also depends on access to healthcare and to a lot of other resources and services. I think that comes into play when we think about the effects of isolation, particularly on health outcomes. If you live in a more rural area, it's harder to get to your doctor. It's harder to access healthy food sometimes. So that may also be at play in those numbers.
Let me add one more aspect to it. When you're talking to young people nowadays, whatever their background, they say, you know what, I'm not part of any organized religion. And irrespective of every religion, that's a congregation place. People interact with each other. And then there is hopefully a connection with a higher power. So I'm not saying the ones who are alone are not connecting with the higher power, but I think the connection with fellow beings in a weekly basis or a whatever time basis has value as well. So that's something, and I don't know if there's a study or to prove that the people who are part of any congregation are less lonely or not. But when you do see is that if somebody is alone without support and they're in the hospital, somebody from their faith group comes from that congregation to help them out and interact with them and drive them to different places. So there's other connections that happen too.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. It's about building our social support during our lifetime so that during those awkward or detrimental moments in our life where we need help and we need that additional support, that we've got that social support built already, right? So if people are, and I think if we look back 100 years ago, certainly a lot of people would attend a religious service of whatever type on a weekly basis. And it was about more than the religion. It was about that social connection. And given that we don't have a lot of people doing that any longer, we need to be thinking about, well, what else can we do? Can libraries really ramp up programming around social connectivity? Can libraries serve as that place where people in our community just come together and do something together and enjoy each other's company and build our social support network? I don't know what the solution is, but I think it's a little bit of a lot coming together and building up our community supports, enabling each of the residents to build up their social support. So when they need that extra TLC, there are people there in their lives.
I was just gonna say, so many moons ago, I saw this therapist and she explained to me that building community around me is as simple as thinking about it like a concentric circles, like a target, where you have a bullseye and all the circles around. And I was brought up in the kind of household where everything is all in. And I think a lot of people, are brought up in that kind of, it's like you're either all in or you're out, right? And I didn't know and understand until I got into my 30s that it was appropriate and healthy to create the kind of relationships around me that sit in different kinds, the people that, maybe things are going crazy in my life and I need a couch to crash on. That's my inner circle. But there's the people that you met at work who might just be your happy hour social circle, or the people you take a walk or a hike with, or, the people you've met at work who, become sort of part of your community, but not your inner circle. And I think this is part of the challenge of young people, especially coming out of the world of social, is that they see such intimate experiences that people are having online that they think they're in an inner circle where they're not. And they don't know how to be in the gray, in the circles beyond. It's either I'm out or I'm in. And they don't know how to build the kind of community that you're describing, or you're describing about congregation, right? Or we're talking about these things, or even work. It's like, I actually think part of it is how do we help teach people at all ages the healthiness of relationships and what they, how they can serve both parties, not how they should be, but how they can support you in all aspects of your life. And I don't know if that's a skill that people really have or understand. I think you were
also-
gonna say something else, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Along those lines, when you were describing the idea of telling people about relationships, I think that we get the opposite message in our culture, though, where being on your own, doing for yourself, not relying on others for anything is highly valued in our culture. And that's a real tension when you're trying to balance that with encouraging folks that you really do need relation. You need connection with others. I think about that old Army commercial of I'm an army of one, which is ridiculous. It just makes absolutely no sense. But for some reason, that idea sold the Army for something, even though it's anathema to what the Army is about. But for some reason, that was enough to get people to think about, I can do it all on my own. I don't need anybody's help, was an attractive idea.
And I would contrast that with the old-fashioned barn raisings, where community members would come out and help a neighbor raise a barn. And it was about an entire weekend of gathering together with your neighbors to do some work for sure, but there was food involved, there was good times involved, right? So it's going with the farming analogy there. RV and farming, and it made me think about that
Go
anyway.
back. So we are kind of edging over into this territory, so I want to speak to it a little bit. So, what you're mentioning is like that sense of belongingness
Yes,
in community.
yes.
And there's a lot of research in the past 10, 20 years looking at the other side of the coin. So positive psychology, looking at sense of belongingness and whether or not that is protective against those adverse health outcomes, whether it's morbidity due to cancer, heart disease, et cetera, or mortality even. And the data are really striking, which is unsurprising, but it is encouraging to see that they are protective, and that's even protective amongst people regardless of the size of their social network. So the question is how to instill that. And some of it may relate to your upbringing and to your family and to the community in which you're raised. And beyond that, I think it's still a question.
And I think it's different for each of us. Certainly, I think we need to be helping one another, improve our sense of belonging and give space, right? And listen to each other and to lift each other up. I know that sounds very, like how do you actually do that, Deb, right? How does one do that? And I think it comes in everyday moments. There are grocery stores over in the UK that have set up a line for people that want to talk. They call it the slow line. And so you can knowingly enter the slow line. And what they do is they take the grocery store cashier who loves to talk, and they put that person in the slow line, and everyone gets time to talk. And what's happening now is that those are filling up and the lines are so long that they're opening up 2 slow lines and 3 slow lines. Because it's just giving people an opportunity to have a conversation.
That's so interesting in a time when they're also having more and more of the self-checkouts.
The business acumen there of like, right, exactly.
But it's a unique solution, right? And it's was something a grocery store chain could do to improve social connectivity
Yeah,
locally.
wow.
I
My
think
biggest nightmare, by the way.
Self-checkout.
Want to get in and get out.
I was gonna add that, I come from a bias of action, toward action, and I think about like, well, if I were sitting in this room or sitting on something, be like, well, what could I do right now that I could take away? In my mind, I think there's something about curiosity. We're talking about social media, and all of us can get super curious. It's the kind of curious you would have if you were like cyber stalking, an ex-boyfriend or an ex-girlfriend online, we can get there, right? We're super curious and we can be all in on something. And what if we applied that kind of curiosity to our conversations, our interest in others, our dialogues at work, our relationships with even the grocery checker you may or may not meet, but, just even moments of curiosity where we ask an open-ended question and just breathe. It doesn't have to be a two-way dialogue. It can be an open-ended question, an opportunity for response, and a thank you. It doesn't have to take a long time, but I think that there's a power in curiosity that actually exists for almost everyone right now because of social. And if we just applied that curiosity just a teeny bit in our interpersonal dynamics, it might change how we interact and how we get along. I'll just give you one quick story and then I'll stop monopolizing the time. But I was on a call today, on a Teams call, and there was a guy, I'll leave his name out of it, and he was so aggressive, like angry and frustrated and defensive. And
I know his name.
yeah, we all know this guy, right? Yeah, we've all met him. And I was watching this and we were in a really intense situation, and his response was, you could very clearly tell he's getting different direction from 3 different leaders. And he wants not to let anyone down. He wants to do the best job he possibly can. And he is getting frustrated, and you can see that. And had he had that ability to step back and be like, from a curious place, what are we solving for? What I'm hearing right now is, 3 of you giving me 3 different directions, and that's going to make it really difficult for me to be productive. So I just pause. What are we solving for? Curious question. But we are so wired right now in so many ways for a heightened sense of alert that I think we bring that into all aspects of our interpersonal experiences. And this is what I'm talking about, just basic, like simple curiosity at all ages, in all interactions could dramatically change, I think, the way we feel, whether it's isolated or lonely or belonging or any of these other things.
We don't necessarily have the patience to go with that curiosity because we're so used to typing something into Google and 0.03 seconds later, you have 15 links that you could click right in front of your face. So sometimes that space to pause. I mean, I'm guilty of it. You're scrolling and a video doesn't load up onto the next, right? You don't give it a second to come back. And are we giving that in our everyday life as well?
Yeah. One of the programs in one of my towns in South Windsor, we started was with the seniors. They're volunteers who actually make a phone call, a well-checked phone call to the other seniors. And then there's a longer conversation call once a week, where it's just like a much more in-depth conversation about what's happening in your life. Tell me about your children and so on. It's the same person for that person. So it's not like a new person. So it's sort of a way we looked at. I was thinking of automation. I brought this to automation. Look, in political world, we call these automated calls and say, do you want to talk to a real person? You press 1. Say, no, we'll do it the right way by humans calling, and they did the right thing. So, and that's working well because you get to hear from the seniors who are benefiting from those conversations with individuals. And then both found a purpose.
Well, and that's, when you're talking about the senior population specifically, like I can remember when my grandparents were there and they'd say, everything you guys do now is text. Nobody picks up the phone. And for that generation, I imagine that's where you're seeing a lot of benefit on something like that.
Yeah.
And Debbie, you with, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got our statewide T at 3 intergenerational friendship community that connects a college student in Connecticut with an older adult for a weekly phone call. We pair two people 1-to-1 based upon common interests, and we give them conversation prompts each week. And this semester, it's our 9th semester, we have 90 people participating. We have students from 6 universities participating. We offer it totally free of charge. All we ask is that people commit to a 20-minute phone call once a week. And the results have just been phenomenal for the older adults and for the young adults too. And I know that what we hear is that the first couple of weeks, a lot of the young adults find it a very awkward conversation because they're not used to speaking on the phone. And so just overcoming that and being able to have a conversation on the phone is sort of step one, right? And then you get to grow a friendship with someone and you get to form a bond with someone. And it's just been a joy to watch it happen.
I'm curious to know, does that ever translate into people meeting in person?
Sometimes they do, yes. And that can happen outside of the program after those 12 weeks. And we've had people become running partners. We've had people meet at the library just to engage over a book. So we've had older adults invite go to their college students' college graduation, right? So they've been invited and actually given a ticket, one of the limited tickets to go to their graduation. So there's some bonds that form that are multi-year, long after the 12 weeks.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
I just saw a hand, no. So where do you think we go from here? You know, we talk about it, we all have these great ideas and we all have, you know, thoughts of where this maybe took a turn. What do you think is the next step for this conversation? Is the next step for this problem, really? Anyone could take that.
I would say greater awareness amongst the public. Like, we all know about this. We know it's a problem, but does the average person? Can they speak to the Surgeon General's report? Probably not. And just kind of giving that information, raising awareness, providing that education in a meaningful way and in a more widespread fashion.
Do you think people are surprised to hear that we are so, some people are surprised to hear that we are so disconnected? Is it hard to maybe put forth that idea to someone when we're, you know, you're thinking to yourself, well, I could open my phone right now and reach out to 10 people faster than I ever could before. Do you think people, maybe, as you mentioned, like, is everybody aware? Do you think that the awareness is there? And that's there's not a right or wrong answer there, but I'm just curious. Do you think people realize it is as big of an issue as it is?
I don't think they do. And along the lines of what you were saying is, I think maybe with awareness, there's such for a good number of people, there's a focus on wellness and there's focus on wellness at workplaces, schools. And if you tell people that loneliness can lead to a lot of adverse health events, just as much as eating too much sugar or not being active, not having physical activity. If you let people know that that can be a source of poor health and that part of your wellness is having social connection, that might be a way of raising awareness and making it less of an odd thing to tell people, like, don't be lonely. You know, you can't tell people that. But if you tell people that loneliness leads to poor health, that might get people to think about it in a different way.
And by just talking about it, you're taking away the taboo, like you're mentioning.
Hey, Margot, you feel very lonely and isolated back here.
Come on up to the front.
Bruce, would you like to sit at the table?
Yeah, no, I want to sit at the table. I was thinking about that question that we do here. I'm Bruce Simons on the board here. And one thing we were thinking about in any part of healthcare we see, whether it's cardiology, especially orthopedics, it feels like you walk into a shiny new building and it's beautiful, right? The seats are comfortable. There's practically a barista there, right? And then we know there's behavioral healthcare, especially amongst some demographics, maybe suffering more with loneliness and isolation. It's almost like any room's okay in any kind of condition. And one thing that we've taken here as a board here and as an organization, we're building really nice facilities. We asked ourselves, if this is such a problem in society and why aren't we making our facilities facilitate these types of interactions? I mean, that's what a facility is, right? It's supposed to facilitate everything we're talking about. And that's what we're doing here. And I think trying to, and we think that should be, we feel kind of like we're an outlier and this should be kind of a normal, and I think that, when I look at some of the, that question, so I look at it about who needs to get, if Senator Amor, you mentioned policymakers, and it could be at our local community level that they're creating bridges and sidewalks and connections that way in the way city planning can be, right? That a lot of people are isolated because we mentioned they can't use a car, or they're in a facility maybe with like no natural light. And I think that there's like, we look also at kind of the physical aspect so that the interaction between like a clinical person and a patient, or whether someone trying to help someone and someone receiving the help, that could be a better interactions. And we're just noticing, I think you see that in the workplace right now. I just noticed a lot of people, they want their people back in the office. They're afraid to have them come back in the office because they're afraid if I tell too many, it's hard hiring people. Maybe they'll go work somewhere else. But most CEOs, they want their personnel to come back into their office. So they're trying to like, how can I make that office environment better so that people want to come back? And I
The
think
built environment is a big part.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
that's what you're saying.
that's what I'm getting to.
How
Yeah,
do we build the environment, not only our communities,
yeah,
right? So where we place an adult living community in relation
Yes.
to what the downtown, right? And is there an opportunity for people to be able to connect easily, but even within a physical space, within a building, is there a congregation area? Is there a bench outside of a meeting room where people can sit on a very just spur of the moment and have a conversation? Thinking about all those
Yeah.
little things can be
a
helpful.
bench.
Yes, a bench.
We added the picnic tables to our memorial garden, which is in the
There you
back.
go.
And I will say, since those two have been added, I have seen staff members eating together outside
Yes.
or orientation groups taking a break and walking through. It's given them a place to meet. So kind of like the supermarket is giving people a place to check in and check out by yourself, or a place to go and talk, or our lobbies are warm and inviting, and it's giving people a moment to stay out of the cold in a
Yes.
place that feels respectable and you feel dignified to be in.
Yes.
Well, Bruce has kicked us off in the Q&A portion. So with that, does anybody else have any questions? We'll open it up
Yes,
to the
sir.
folks in
Fire
the
one up.
audience.
First of all, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful talk. But we're talking a lot about built spaces, and personally, I've heard a lot in the past few years about these notions of third spaces. Places that we create where we can go and we can be warm and be with other people without necessarily the expectation of buying something, spending money. Have any of you seen that kind of a phenomenon reflected in the data or in whatever studies may be conducted, or is that more of something that's just being talked about without being backed up?
There are
It's-
studies that back up what you're saying, that when you create third spaces, it increases belongingness for community members.
Fascinating.
Yes.
See, in my lifetime, I can't think of what a third space is that actually exists for people my age. What do all of you seem to think a third space could look
Oh,
like?
interesting. So parks, right? Locations within a town center where people can gather. It could be building out a sidewalk to, where a restaurant expands into the sidewalk for a period of time. Or an alleyway that gets shut down every once in a while for a community gathering, right? That's a temporary third space.
I was at the Meriden Mall the other day, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's not, in the best condition. However, I was fascinated. I went there because they opened a pickleball court in the old Navy. In case you're into pickleball, they have a pickleball court, really inexpensive in the old Navy. However, I didn't realize where it was, and I parked on the opposite side on accident. So I ended up walking all the way through the mall to get to the pickleball area, which you would think would be okay because I was going to exercise, but different conversation. Anyway, on my way by, I see a space, and in the space, it was an old store that was just a place for people to play board games. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. They're selling board games. I went in, they're not selling any board games. And in fact, then I started opening my eyes. I realized through the whole mall, they have started to build these spaces where people can just hang out. And this is the same area, that same mall, they're also adding Yale New Haven, multiple different medical medical, what do you call them? Where patients go?
Clinics.
Clinics, thank you. I'm like, not office, I don't know what they're called, but anyway, they're adding, so they're actually making the space, no expectation for spend, but patients will be coming to the space to see their doctors, maybe have to wait and everything, and you can actually go and play board games with anybody who's there at the space in this Meriden Mall, which you would never even think was happening. And again, in there, they had all these other spaces and even pickleball. Wonderful.
The Manchester Mall, I went recently. It was empty.
Mhm.
And that was a place where certain parts of the day, it was like filled with young boys and girls hanging out, having conversations. And that was like the space. Not anymore, because there's nothing to buy, or it's too expensive to buy, whatever the issue is, but they're not using that space.
Yeah, pickleball.
They should.
My patients in the past, used to love going to the mall to walk.
Yeah.
Because they would feel safe and they would be able to see people they know and engage, in a meaningful way. So that's lost a little
Yeah,
bit too.
yeah.
Great question.
I don't know that it's a question, but it's a
Thought?
a thought, and a question might come out of it, but I just wrote a bunch of notes down because everything you said was so relatable. And I just wanted to share, like, so my name is Shaylin. I have a private practice in Hamden, and Cheshire, and I used to work at Rushford for Stephen. And I can still consider myself an extrovert, but once COVID hit, so I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after COVID started, and with twins, and just started working from home. So I have been, this extroverted person with a huge network, and I would go out and I have all these friends, and then COVID hit and I got pregnant and I was isolated, and I, spent all that time at home, and now my kids will be 4 on Sunday. And I work from home, and I want to see my friends, my coworkers, people that work for me, but I don't want to go to the store anymore. I used to love running errands. Now when my husband goes to Costco, I'm like, I'm not doing that. He jokes that I'm an agoraphobic, which I'm not, but it's like a joke. Something has changed for me. It's like not the same person that I used to be. So what you said is very, very relatable.
I would wonder, do you mind if I would get curious with you for a
Please.
second? Because interestingly, I think people have self-identified as extroverts and introverts for many years for maybe reasons that may or may not be really as accurate. And perhaps the way in which you've recharged and learned to recharge is actually serving you, and that there is a pressure to perform or act in a certain way that never actually felt aligned to how aligned you are now with
Yeah.
what serves you.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, everything that you're speaking about the loneliness, so I work from home. I'm the owner. I mean, I have a lot of interactions with my. Someone's trying to recruit me. I have I have an admin team, and they manage the staff, but I have a lot of interactions with the admin team. And I find myself throughout the day being like, oh, it's kind of quiet today. I gotta reach out to someone, because I feel my husband is off working, my kids are at school, and I'm home. And if the phone isn't going off, I feel lonely. And I don't reach out to, I have great friends, but they're all in other states. They all have kids, and we're all getting older, and so we don't have as much interaction. I have a great network. My mom calls me 7 times a day. I have great family support, but like, there's a couple of people that I go to, but it's it's lonely. It's just like a different world now, and now I have these two 4-year-olds that I'm raising, and I don't want them to live in this world. I want them to live in the world that I did when I was young and there were no cell phones and you had to show up. You said you were gonna show up somewhere to meet a friend, you showed up. You didn't just cancel on them like we can now, but I don't know how to do that.
Well, I would, if you don't mind me, recommending that you just be really thoughtful and introspective for yourself on what brings you joy and what would make you feel fulfilled,
Yeah.
and that you start to chase a little bit of that.
Yeah, there's a show on Netflix recently about sparking joy. If anyone has seen it, and I've been referencing it quite a bit lately, I don't know. Because you get so into the routine, like we're isolated. I work and I raise kids and I'm home and I don't know.
You have
it
to be
sparks
intentional
joy.
about it.
Exactly.
The intentionality, I think, is what, when we talk to people, we hear this all the time, right? And you have to be intentional, like if you know that you need a change.
Yeah.
And you know you're feeling lonely and you want to find your way out of that. Sometimes it's having a conversation with a family member or a trusted friend to say, hey, can you hold me true to this? I need to do this for myself and I need some help.
Well, that's why I called Steven. Because I've been, running a practice as an owner for 10 years and that's isolating in itself, especially in a COVID virtual world. And I thought it's time to just get out there, and not just work from home, wearing my yoga pants every day, actually leave the house. So.
Well, thanks for not signing up for the virtual tickets tonight.
So normalize for a second and then we can move on. You've been through a lot from pre-COVID to having twins and then your life with twins. That's a lot of transition,
Yeah.
personal transition over a very short period of time.
Right.
And I'm a mom as well, and I was pregnant during COVID, so I understand what that was like and feeling isolated in the pregnancy. And so you're kind of rediscovering what it means to be yourself at this point.
Yeah. Thank you.
And
for
this
that.
version of yourself. So I would also take time to be kind to yourself.
Thanks.
So even if you do feel lonely, the fact that you're even able to articulate that, I think is really important,
Thank
especially
you.
with all these people,
Yeah.
and to
Yeah.
own that,
Yeah.
but also to be reaching out.
Oh, thank you. And I'll move on in a second, but, it was literally COVID started mid-March and I found out I was pregnant March 29th and my husband couldn't come to any of the ultrasounds. He couldn't even come to the birth because I got COVID when I was 8 months pregnant. And so I did that alone, a C-section. And then no one could come over for months. And so that's just when this all started, it's just been this new world. So everything you're saying is on point,
Well, thank you for sharing all of that with all of us. And please, just keep looking for what you're wanting and you're seeking. And I think that you'll be able to find it. It just may be not coming as fast as you want it to.
She's great. She's gonna find it.
I'm working on it. Thank you. I appreciate listening and the feedback.
Yeah, so back to kind of about a question, so I'm a sociologist, so I kind of think about the social level stuff here, and so I wonder if any of your all's work or research or anything consider sort of these, sort of the last few decades, how work is outpaced, pay, and we're working longer hours for less pay, so you spend 10, 12 hours at work, you're exhausted, you come home, and you're in this cycle, so is there any research or I guess insight into how the role of this hustle culture, this sort of constant work plays into this increased experience of isolation as well as the feelings of loneliness? You just don't have the time or even the capacity, because you come home from work, the last thing you wanna do is go back out. You know, I don't know if y'all had any research or insights into that.
I can give you my HR perspective on it from my many years of being in HR is, I think part of I imagine there's a lot of realness to the research around the hustle culture and how that leads to some of what we're talking about here. I think a lot of it is perceived, what we're supposed to or think we should do, and how we define success in this country.
Mhm.
And you said it earlier, somebody said it earlier about how we have the value of like, I can do it all, in particular for women.
Yeah.
We have this like idea that we can do it all. And I am an advocate of teaching the idea of assertive being a healthy word. So while I can't speak to research about it, because that's not my field, what I can say is as an employer, I am a strong advocate of not cultivating cultures of hustle. What I do like is cultures of results and cultures of success. And I think organizations can create that. It starts with, though, it's supply and demand. If the demand by employees is that they have a different culture, the supply has to change. And the problem is that people are afraid to demand what's best for them. And this goes back to teaching people how to express themselves in a productive way. Like I was saying earlier about my friend on the call earlier, I think this is a perpetual cycle. So at least I think there's a solution for it. And I do believe that more and more employees, talent, are demanding a different work environment. And I think the more we demand a work environment that looks different, the more likely we are to see that culture shift. How it shows up in the research, I believe that hustleness is creating isolation and loneliness, certainly for all the reasons you described. I just think there's more that we can do about it. And we have this perceived fear because at the bottom of the hierarchy, right, of Maslow, it's like, well, I have a need to survive, right? And I need money to do that. And so I'm in this power, right, relationship with my job. But I don't think it has to be that way.
I'm gonna add a couple of thoughts. We may not have the example for the study over here, but if you look at the Japanese culture, you know how sometimes at work, people used to go say, we'll like have lunch together. They have dinner together because they keep working through lunch hour till dinner. That's when they're having dinner. It's like the work hours are insanely long and committed. I'll bring it to dopamine. What brings that dopamine for the people in a society is the happiness, is that they are able to put in certain amount of hours of work. And that changes based on how we start to function. So an athlete is running, he or she, after they do a little bit more than the previous day, their dopamine is going to be a little higher. And that's probably what is happening to the society where they're not stepping back. I think the Europeans have it right for the most part. They're able to take time off and give that space when they need to. And some of the other societies are actually, and some of the European companies move to United States because they get more work hours from the people over here. And that's how they're making some of the profits. And if they move to Japan, they'll probably make even more. But there is something to be said about what you're saying is that people are getting their dopamines in such a manner. Now in Japan, the number of people who have chosen to be single has increased enormously because they don't think that their life is compatible with having any kind of a relationship. So it's a very interesting situation that you're touched on, and it's very real as well. And we are on that trajectory, unfortunately.
I think there are better employers, though. And sometimes I tell people, if you're miserable, you should look for another job. I mean, you know, and I think that's, yeah, and I think the employers and companies are separating themselves on that, how they treat people. And you know, some are more conscious and some are less conscious. And the idea that you were bringing about when someone's having a day, how can I support you? Some people that has a lot of value as much as money.
Yeah.
Is in terms of, you know, how can I support time? How you help people with time? But what really popped up here, because I'm a panel member now too. Okay.
Yes, you're not getting a gift.
But when you're talking about the third place over here, I don't know if there's a podcast called Acquired, if you're familiar with it. And I encourage you, you should listen to it. It's a great podcast. You should listen to Acquired, and they have Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks. And it's fascinating, and it goes to this whole point of, Starbucks, we read about how it's gone down in performance, right? The performance of the actual companies going down. There's a new CEO. I'm sure a lot of us, it's pretty popular in business culture that they're trying to turn around. He's trying to figure out, Howard Schultz was talking around as the founder of the third place, that big third place, that was literally Starbucks, was the third place.
Fascinating.
Right, that kind of brought, I think, that word into kind of popular culture. So what he was saying is this whole idea of like creating all these insane varieties of drinks was putting so much pressure on the baristas. It was, it's like, what I mean? It was like this trying to like be everything to everybody and trying to do all this stuff. It was so all this staff, the baristas, were miserable, and he's listening to them, and they're going to be making changes. You'll see that, right? Now, before COVID, when COVID struck, they took all those stations where you poured your own milk in there, right? They took that away and they gave that to the barista. Gave more work to the barista, and to the customer, they're like, it's not really what I wanted. And now we know I just paid $8 for a latte. It's not really how I wanted it, or a coffee, right? So that was one thing that was important, but then they started looking at all these, so that was one change where you'll start seeing they're going to put all that back out on that table. And then the second thing that they're going to have is this idea of the app and using technology. The idea is that this is great. You can get your drink, you can run right in and run right out. Well, what did they do? They took that interaction between the person and the barista, and it's killing their sales. Meaning they turn themselves into a commodity. They were third place.
Well, it also sounds like it's tying more things together, because if the baristas are being given more tasks, they're working more hours, they're more exhausted. So it sounds like it's kind of all tying together. If I recall correctly, Starbucks is actually being actively boycotted because of the way they treat their baristas. So I think it's fascinating that they may have started as a third place and then become this kind of symbol of the exact opposite.
And this whole idea of the app, they actually using the technology in an app, what you're talking about, they look at, there's like a lot of danger to that in terms of separating themselves from, from a competition. If it's just a place that you kind of run in and run out of and don't talk to anybody.
I want to speak to the research side of your question. So your question, I think of it in two different ways. So there's certainly like the context in which we're living and working at this point, but there's also the personality. So the earliest research in my area of cardiovascular behavioral medicine was looking at people who were deemed type A. So high time pressure, achieving, almost to a fault, and looking at the association between that personality type and incident cardiovascular disease. And no surprise, there were associations, although eventually the literature looked a little more mixed. But what you're speaking to really is about chronic stress, right? And chronic strain related to our work and the number of pressures that are imposed upon us based on the society in which we live. And there's so much research showing those connections, whether it's related to work, caregiving, our relationships, or marital strain, or a combination of all of those stressors. And those, again, forecast adverse consequences for our health. But the silver lining is that in some other studies, later studies, they showed that social support mediates or helps to decrease or protect against those adverse effects. So even if we can't necessarily immediately change the culture in which we live, work, and play, we can still use what we know about social connection to help mitigate those effects. Sure.
Darcy's telling me Jacob has a question.
Can I just make a comment while we wait for a question?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead with the comment. No, go ahead with the comment. I don't want to steal the panel's thunder.
Just a quick little thing. Somebody made this comment some time ago for the young people in our society say that the odds are against them. I said, why do you say that? So the smartest people in most industries, their only job is to get them connected to the screen at all times. And they will do whatever it takes, whether it's on the big screen or a small screen. The smartest people in the industry are focusing on how do we keep the next generation or the current generation and the future generations onto the screen. And so it's a tough situation that we are in because that's how people are making their money and their entire world is based on this. I'm just gonna make that comment. So it's and the corporations at times are not looking at the best interest of the negative outcomes that happen from their actions. And that's where the policies have to come in. Australia, I believe, just made a law, nobody less than the age of 16 can be on social media or something. I think that came out very recently.
Just today, I think.
Yeah, and in Connecticut, I proposed that bill about 4 years ago. And we had no business doing it because it's a federal issue, but we were able to raise the conversation in Connecticut and at the federal level to start to have that conversation because they were having contracts. These multi-billion-dollar companies are having contracts with their 13-year-old children. And if your neighbor had a contract with your 13-year-old children, you would have them in jail. But these corporations are having those kind of contracts with their children to sell their data and then put them on algorithmic ways. If they were asking for something bad, they will send more bad stuff to them, how to kill themselves, God forbid, or change their behaviors about themselves. And then this is part of the corporation not being responsible. And that's where policies have to start to look at them.
I think one of the top YouTube earners was like a 7-year-old reviewing toys.
Yeah.
Is one of the top earners on YouTube. I want to get to Jacob, his voice in the sky. Jacob, if you want to ask a question, yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we definitely have gone to what Orwell wrote about, right? That's definitely to a degree. We know that people avoid pain and discomfort, and having working relationships with people is painful. And I'm sorry for the young woman who was speaking before, but the most important thing that I could do for you if I was there is just to give you a hug. And I think that most people avoid that now because they don't know how somebody else is going to take it, including words, etc. But before I go on my soapbox, I see the time is 7:49. Everybody has raised some good points, and I would probably be redundant on some of them, other than bringing up the point of embracing the darkness, what Aaron Rodgers with the Jets discussed as you're talking about something menial as sporting. But it's true, and identifying and adapting to isolation and reframing it as solitude is definitely a way that we can broach that. And I definitely agree with the decrease in religious community civic engagement. Definitely is a loss for folks, including the higher power piece. I wanted to speak to the physiology of broken heart syndrome to the folks that are the researchers and the pulmonologists and the cardiologists up there. We know about HPA access. We know about the ACE study. And I just wanted to know if there was a specific way that tie into the heart-brain issue, not just mind-body, but the specific neuropathy of what happens during broken heart syndrome and how to address that to the different parts of the brain with individualized therapy, other than EMDR, which I know is an evidence-based treatment. I know that when we talk to people and quote unquote give therapy, no matter how much motivational interviewing, I think that I've seen a lot of people miss the boat when it comes to how we engage. Is there a way that you would be able to tell us, whether or not you're a researcher or practitioner, what is one of the ways to really dig into either the amygdala, the hippocampus, and really breaking the trend of the damage that broken heart syndrome presents?
I can take a stab, and I think the others can join in. I'll give you an answer in the roundabout manner. So the broken heart syndrome is basically from a very bad news that a person gets and their stress hormone is very high, causing an immediate effect on the cardiac working. It's almost giving like somebody a big dose of epinephrine. And then after you give a big dose of epinephrine, when we are resuscitating somebody, the heart doesn't pump very well. After it has pumped very, very well. But it has that impact. I think the counter to that, which you touched on, is something that has been proven very well. It's pretty fascinating. There are many parts of the world where people on an average live the longest in the world. They're the highest number of people who live over the age of 100. These are the blue zones. And if you start to look at what are the blue zones and what are the things that people are doing that is making them live longer, some of the things are pretty fascinating. One, they are very much in love with their families. Two, they actually have gatherings with their friends where they're having happiness and moments of good time together with families. Three, they're connected with a faith, and it could be any faith. That's also proven. It's not one faith, it's any faith. And four, they have a passion for something bigger than themselves. None of them are signed medical. So that there is value in how you are reducing the stress in your life and keeping a healthy way, because cardiac disease are inflammatory diseases. Strokes are inflammatory diseases, and you reduce the inflammation by living a healthy life, you live longer. And then there are other things that you eat healthy and then other components which make more sense from a medical perspective, but this is the amygdala level conversation that I want to touch on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'm glad to jump in as well. Thank you for explaining so nicely. So the other name for that is called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. And as mentioned, it's basically an irregular ballooning of the heart, and it's due to like a sudden negative event. So your spouse of 60 years dies without any warning. It's often seen in those types of cases. It's also very rare. So we're still learning about how to treat it, how to manage that. I know that there have been more recent efforts around mindfulness in patients with a history of Takotsubo, but I can't necessarily speak to the neurologic pathways underlying those treatments per se. I do know that they've shown some effectiveness so far.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And as much as imagery and something like that as well, it's not just the prefrontal cortex that we need to speak to human beings with. It's the underlying, middle brain. That's really where I feel that the tachycardia really goes to. And I think that if we all had ID cards that says how well our brain and heart function, I think we would treat people a lot differently then.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And I want to give everybody a chance to eat and mingle casually. So I think, this conversation is clearly so interesting and also so important to everybody here. I think we all could keep going on it. Clearly, there's a lot of different ways to go, but I think, I would be remiss if I didn't thank everybody who came here tonight in person, because this is ultimately what we're talking about, is that human connection and the conversation. So I thank all of our panelists. You guys did a beautiful job. And thank you to all of our attendees. Stay, eat, mingle, keep the conversation going, and follow us on social for our next community forum. Thank you, everyone.
Very nice.
Oh God, that's him, my hero. I'm so glad to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Wow.
Very powerful.
Literally once you. I was like, you never know. I'd love to get a photo of all the panelists together.
Margo, let's take some pictures with the panel too.
I panel.